A man stands in the Tower of London, 1535, his clothes worn, his body weakened by months of imprisonment, yet his mind sharper than ever. Sir Thomas More, once the most powerful man in England after the king himself, had refused to bend. He'd given up wealth, position, family, everything except his conscience. In a few days, he'd walk to the scaffold and make a joke before placing his head on the block. But this moment of defiance wasn't the beginning of his story. It was the inevitable conclusion of a life spent navigating an impossible tension between earthly power and eternal truth, between human friendship and divine law, between the demands of conscience and the crushing weight of political reality. More's life embodied a paradox that would consume him entirely. Here was a man who loved laughter and wrote biting satire, yet died for refusing to compromise on theological principle. A devoted family man who wore a hair shirt in secret penance. A Renaissance humanist who imagined radical social equality in fiction while serving an absolute monarch in reality. A brilliant lawyer who used every legal trick to defend his position, then accepted an obviously unjust verdict with serene grace. Every major decision More made contained its own contradiction. Yet these contradictions pointed toward truths about human nature, political power, and moral integrity that his contemporaries couldn't fully grasp. If you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate hitting that like button or subscribing. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. I'm always curious about where you're tuning in from, so drop a comment letting me know your city and what time it is there. I love watching our little community connect across time zones through these late-night explorations. Now, get comfortable, dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for some gentle white noise, and let's settle into tonight's journey together. We're going to explore why Thomas More remains one of history's most fascinating and complicated figures. A man whose choices still challenge us to think about the price of integrity in a world that demands compromise. Part 1. The Formation of a Humanist Mind. Thomas More was born in 1478 into a London that was finally emerging from decades of civil war. The Wars of the Roses had just ended with Henry Tudor's victory at Bosworth Field, and England was beginning to taste stability after generations of bloodshed between aristocratic factions. More's father, John More, was a successful lawyer and judge. Not nobility, but solidly established in that rising professional class that would come to dominate Tudor England. This social position shaped everything about Thomas More's worldview. He wasn't born into the aristocracy with its inherited privileges and feudal assumptions, nor was he from the common people with their immediate material struggles. He belonged to that middle realm, where advancement came through education, skill, and service rather than blood or land. The young More received an education that was revolutionary for its time. He was placed in the household of Cardinal John Morton, Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Chancellor of England, where he served as a page while absorbing the sophisticated political and intellectual culture of England's highest circles. Morton recognized the boy's exceptional intelligence and sent him to Oxford at 14, where More encountered the new learning that was transforming European intellectual life. This was humanism, not the secular philosophy we associate with that word today, but rather a passionate engagement with classical Greek and Roman texts that promised to recover ancient wisdom and apply it to contemporary problems. More threw himself into the study of Greek, Latin, history, and rhetoric with an intensity that would characterize his entire intellectual life. He read Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Ethics, Cicero's philosophical dialogues, and Seneca's moral essays. But he also read the early church fathers, Augustine, Jerome, Chrysostom, discovering in them a Christianity that was intellectually rigorous and morally demanding rather than merely ritualistic. This combination of classical learning and patristic theology created a distinctive intellectual framework that would define More's mature thought. He believed that human reason, properly trained through classical education, could discover moral and political truths that complemented rather than contradicted Christian revelation. The tension between intellectual pursuit and spiritual devotion appeared early in More's life. After leaving Oxford, he lived for 4 years at the London Charterhouse, a Carthusian monastery known for its severe discipline and contemplative life. He participated in the monks' prayers, attended their lectures, and seriously considered taking vows. This wasn't the casual spiritual exploration of a young man testing boundaries. It was a genuine vocational crisis. More was drawn to the monastic ideal of complete dedication to God, the renunciation of worldly ambition, and the pursuit of holiness through prayer and self-denial. Yet he ultimately decided against the monastery, later explaining that he'd rather be a chaste husband than an unchaste priest. This decision reveals something fundamental about More's psychology and philosophy. He wasn't choosing worldly success over spiritual devotion, but rather recognizing that his particular talents and temperament were better suited for engagement with the world than withdrawal from it. He could serve God through family life, professional work, and political activity rather than through monastic prayer. But the 4 years at the Charterhouse left permanent marks. For the rest of his life, More wore a hair shirt beneath his fine clothes as a reminder of mortality and a form of private penance. He maintained a disciplined prayer life, rising before dawn for devotions. And he never lost the sense that earthly achievements were ultimately meaningless compared to the eternal destiny of the soul. More's legal career began in earnest when he was called to the bar in 1501. He quickly established himself as one of London's most brilliant lawyers, known for his penetrating analysis of complex cases and his ability to construct seemingly unassailable legal arguments. But More's legal practice wasn't merely a path to wealth and status. It was an intellectual and moral exercise. The law represented humanity's attempt to create order and justice through reason and tradition. And practicing law well required the same combination of classical learning and moral judgment that defined humanist education. A good lawyer needed to understand human nature, social relationships, and ethical principles, not just technical legal rules. The intellectual community that More joined as a young lawyer was extraordinary. He formed close friendships with John Colet, the dean of St. Paul's Cathedral, who was revolutionizing biblical scholarship by insisting on reading Scripture in its historical context rather than through layers of medieval interpretation. He corresponded with the great Dutch humanist Desiderius Erasmus, who would become his closest intellectual companion and who would later publish a famous description of More's household as a model of humanist learning and Christian charity. He participated in London's vibrant culture of learned conversation, where lawyers, clergy, merchants, and scholars gathered to discuss classical texts, theological questions, and contemporary political issues. This intellectual milieu shaped More's distinctive approach to knowledge and truth. The humanists believed that ancient wisdom could illuminate contemporary problems, but they also insisted that such wisdom needed to be tested against experience and refined through dialogue. Truth emerged through conversation among learned friends who challenged each other's assumptions while maintaining mutual respect and affection. This dialogical approach to truth would characterize all of More's major works, from the conversational structure of Utopia to his polemical exchanges with Protestant reformers, where he often adopted multiple voices and perspectives to explore complex questions from different angles. More's marriage in 1505 to Jane Colt represented another dimension of his attempt to reconcile worldly life with spiritual devotion. He chose Jane deliberately, taking the eldest daughter of a country gentleman rather than pursuing a more advantageous match, and he set about educating her in the classics and sciences. After Jane's death in 1511, More remarried within a month to Alice Middleton, a practical widow with a daughter of her own. This quick remarriage scandalized some of More's friends who expected a period of mourning, but it revealed his conviction that family life required active partnership and that his young children needed a mother more than society needed to witness his grief. The household that More created in London and later at his country estate in Chelsea became famous throughout Europe as an example of how humanist learning could be integrated with family life and religious devotion. More insisted that his daughters receive the same classical education as his son, a radical position at a time when female education was generally limited to domestic skills and basic literacy. Margaret, his eldest and most intellectually gifted daughter, became proficient in Latin and Greek, studied mathematics and astronomy, and engaged in scholarly correspondence with some of Europe's leading intellectuals. More's educational philosophy reflected his conviction that women possess the same rational capacities as men, and that their exclusion from learning was a social custom rather than a natural necessity. But More's household also embodied the tensions that would eventually destroy him. It was simultaneously a place of intellectual freedom and strict moral discipline, of humanist learning and traditional piety, of engagement with the world and preparation for eternity. More encouraged his children to question and debate, yet he demanded absolute obedience on matters of religious practice. He welcomed scholars and friends into free-ranging discussions about politics and society, yet he maintained hierarchical relationships based on traditional notions of authority and submission. He praised reason and learning, yet he insisted that ultimate truth came through revelation and church tradition rather than individual judgment. Part 2. Utopia and the Critique of European Society. In 1515, More was sent on a diplomatic mission to Flanders to negotiate trade disputes. During this mission, he began writing the work that would make him famous throughout Europe and create a new literary genre that still bears its name. Utopia presented itself as a travel narrative describing an island commonwealth with radically different social, economic, and political arrangements than anything existing in 16th century Europe. But Utopia was actually a devastating critique of European society, disguised as an entertaining fiction, and its relationship to More's own beliefs remains one of the most debated questions in intellectual history. The framework narrative of Utopia was deliberately ambiguous. More, the character, meets a traveler named Raphael Hythloday, who has visited the island of Utopia and describes its institutions in enthusiastic detail. More, the character, listens skeptically, raising objections and expressing doubts about whether such radical arrangements could actually work. This literary device allowed the author to present controversial ideas while maintaining plausible deniability about whether he actually endorsed them. Was he seriously proposing that private property should be abolished? Or was he simply showing how European society might look from a radically different perspective? The social arrangements of Utopia represented the inversion of nearly every aspect of 16th century European society. Where Europe had extreme inequality between rich and poor, Utopia had complete economic equality, with all citizens sharing common ownership of goods. Where European cities were filled with idle aristocrats and beggars, Utopia required all citizens to engage in productive agricultural and craft work. Where European society was stratified by hereditary rank and privilege, Utopian society was organized around merit and voluntary respect for wisdom and experience. Where European politics was dominated by dynastic ambition and military conquest, Utopian politics aimed at domestic welfare and avoided war except in self-defense. The most radical feature of Utopian society was the abolition of private property and money. All goods were held in common, with citizens taking what they needed from public storehouses rather than buying and selling through market transactions. This arrangement eliminated the primary sources of conflict and crime in European society: theft, fraud, and violent competition for resources. It also eliminated the psychological corruptions that private property created, including greed, vanity, and the desire to accumulate possessions as markers of social status. Utopians worked 6 hours per day at assigned tasks, with the remaining time devoted to intellectual pursuits, recreation, and community activities. But More's utopia wasn't simply a fantasy of perfected society. It contained features that most readers found deeply troubling. Utopians practiced slavery, keeping convicted criminals and prisoners of war in bondage to perform unpleasant tasks. They required permission from magistrates to travel outside their assigned cities. They practiced euthanasia for the incurably ill. They engaged in premarital nudity inspections to ensure physical compatibility before marriage. These disturbing elements suggested that More wasn't presenting utopia as a blueprint for social reform, but rather as a thought experiment that pushed radical principles to their logical conclusions, revealing both their appeal and their costs. The religious arrangements in Utopia were particularly significant given More's later fate. Utopians practiced religious tolerance, allowing multiple faiths to coexist peacefully as long as practitioners didn't violently impose their beliefs on others. The only religious teaching that was universal in Utopia was belief in divine providence and the immortality of the soul. Citizens who denied these doctrines were excluded from citizenship because such beliefs were seen as necessary for social morality. This religious tolerance contrasted sharply with 16th century European practice, where religious uniformity was enforced through violence and where religious difference was seen as a threat to social order. Yet More's presentation of utopian religion was more complex than simple advocacy for tolerance. Raphael suggests that the utopians, having heard about Christianity from European visitors, were drawn to it particularly because it resembled their own practice of communal living. This implied that Christianity in its pure form was incompatible with private property and economic inequality, a suggestion that directly challenged the wealth and privilege of the 16th century church. But More the character never explicitly endorses this interpretation, leaving readers to puzzle out the relationship between utopian social arrangements and Christian moral teaching. The economic critique embedded in utopia was devastating in its precision. More portrayed European society as fundamentally irrational in its organization of production and distribution. Vast resources were wasted on luxury goods for the wealthy, while basic needs of common people went unmet. Enormous numbers of people engaged in essentially useless occupations: aristocrats and their servants, soldiers preparing for wars of dynastic ambition, lawyers managing disputes over property, merchants manipulating prices for profit. Meanwhile, those who performed genuinely necessary work, farmers, craftsmen, builders, were despised and exploited, forced to sell their labor cheaply, while the fruits of their work enriched others. More's analysis anticipated later economic critiques by recognizing that poverty wasn't a natural condition, but rather a social creation. Europe had sufficient productive capacity to provide comfortable lives for all its inhabitants, but its social organization systematically transferred wealth from producers to non-producers. The system was maintained through a combination of legal coercion and ideological mystification. Laws protected property rights, while religious teaching encouraged the poor to accept their condition as divinely ordained. The result was a society that was simultaneously wealthy and miserable, capable of producing abundance, yet characterized by widespread deprivation. The political critique in Utopia focused on the corruption that resulted when governments served the interests of the wealthy rather than the common good. European monarchs engaged in expensive wars to expand their territories or pursue dynastic claims, financing these wars through heavy taxation that fell primarily on common people. The wealth accumulated through taxation flowed to aristocrats and courtiers who provided military service or political support, creating networks of dependency that had nothing to do with genuine merit or public service. Meanwhile, the laws were written and enforced in ways that protected the property and privileges of the wealthy, while severely punishing crimes of poverty like theft and poaching. More's utopians approached politics completely differently. Their elected officials served limited terms and could be removed if they abused their authority. Important decisions were made through extensive public deliberation rather than by royal decree. War was avoided whenever possible, and when necessary, was fought through strategic cleverness rather than expensive armies. Foreign policy aimed at maintaining peaceful trade relationships rather than territorial expansion. The government's primary function was ensuring that all citizens had access to the resources they needed for comfortable lives rather than serving the interests of a privileged minority. But the ambiguity of utopia extended to its political vision as well. Was More seriously proposing that elected officials were superior to hereditary monarchs? Or was he showing that even the best government required some measure of coercion and limitation on individual freedom? The utopians' extensive regulation of private life, controlling travel, requiring permission for marriage, assigning work, suggested that achieving economic equality and social harmony required sacrificing individual liberty in ways that More himself might have found unacceptable. The literary brilliance of Utopia lay precisely in this ambiguity. More created a text that could be read in multiple ways depending on the reader's perspective and concerns. Radical readers could see it as a blueprint for revolutionary social transformation. Conservative readers could see it as a demonstration that trying to eliminate private property would require unacceptable tyranny. Christian readers could see it as a critique of how European society had betrayed gospel values. Skeptical readers could see it as proof that human nature made perfect justice impossible. This interpretive openness made utopia endlessly fascinating while protecting More from accusations that he was advocating sedition or heresy. The relationship between utopia and More's own convictions remains deeply puzzling. Within 20 years of writing this critique of private property and political authority, More would defend the Catholic Church's wealth and hierarchical structure with passionate intensity. He would serve a king whose power and magnificence embodied everything utopia criticized. He would prosecute heretics with a severity that contradicted utopia's religious tolerance. This apparent contradiction has generated centuries of debate about whether More abandoned his youthful idealism, whether utopia was never meant seriously, or whether More's actual views were more complex than either his fictional island or his later political career suggested. Perhaps the key to understanding utopia lies in recognizing it as an exercise in humanist education rather than a political program. More was demonstrating how classical learning and rational analysis could generate radical alternatives to existing social arrangements, forcing readers to examine and justify practices they'd always taken for granted. He was showing that existing social organization wasn't natural or inevitable, but rather the result of human choices that could be made differently. Whether or not the specific arrangements of utopia were desirable or achievable, the exercise of imagining alternatives developed the critical faculties that humanist education was meant to cultivate. Part 3. The Rise to Power and the Servant of the King. More's entry into royal service represented both the culmination of his professional success and the beginning of his tragic trajectory. In 1517, he accepted a position in Henry VIII's government, initially serving in relatively minor capacities before rising rapidly through the ranks. By 1529, he would become Lord Chancellor, the highest judicial and administrative position in England after the king himself. This rise to power occurred during one of the most culturally brilliant periods of English history, when Henry's court attracted scholars, artists, and intellectuals from across Europe. But it also occurred during the crisis that would ultimately destroy More: Henry VIII's determination to divorce Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn. More's relationship with Henry VIII was complex from the beginning. The king was only 9 years younger than More and shared many of his intellectual interests. Henry was himself a genuine scholar who wrote theological treatises, composed music, and engaged seriously with contemporary learning. He valued More's intelligence and wit, often summoning him to the royal apartments for hours of conversation about theology, philosophy, and politics. More genuinely admired the young king's learning and was initially convinced that Henry would be an ideal monarch who would use his power wisely and justly. But More also understood the dangers of royal favor with unusual clarity. He famously warned his son-in-law William Roper that if my head could win him a castle in France, it should not fail to go. This wasn't paranoid pessimism, but rather clear-sighted recognition of how royal service actually worked. Kings valued servants only as long as those servants served royal purposes, and the slightest hint of disloyalty or failure could transform favor into fatal displeasure. The key to surviving royal service was understanding exactly where the boundaries lay, what could be said or done safely, and what could not. More's years in government service involved him deeply in the religious controversies that were beginning to tear European Christianity apart. Martin Luther's challenge to papal authority and Catholic teaching had sparked a movement that threatened not only church unity, but also the entire social and political order of Europe. Henry VIII initially opposed Luther, writing a defense of the seven sacraments that earned him the title Defender of the Faith from a grateful pope. More assisted with this royal treatise and then wrote his own polemical works attacking Lutheran theology with a ferocity that shocked even his contemporaries. These anti-Lutheran polemics revealed a side of More's personality that seems difficult to reconcile with the tolerant wisdom and gentle wit for which he was famous. He called Luther a shit devil and described Protestant reformers with scatological insults that were crude even by 16th century standards. He defended the burning of heretics as necessary for protecting Christian society from spiritual poison. As Lord Chancellor, he personally interrogated suspected heretics and apparently used his authority to pursue Protestants with genuine zeal. This aggressive intolerance contradicted the religious tolerance he described in Utopia and seemed to betray the humanist emphasis on reason and dialogue that had characterized his early intellectual life. But from More's perspective, there was no contradiction. The religious tolerance in Utopia applied to a hypothetical pagan society that had never received Christian revelation. Once divine truth had been revealed through Christ and preserved through the Church, rejecting that truth wasn't a legitimate exercise of individual judgment, but rather a rebellion against God Himself that threatened the eternal salvation of everyone the heretic might influence. The stakes were literally infinite. Tolerating heresy meant accepting the damnation of souls. Moreover, religious unity was essential for social order. Religious diversity would inevitably lead to faction, conflict, and ultimately civil war. These weren't paranoid fantasies. The religious wars that would devastate Europe for the next century proved that More's fears about the social consequences of religious division were entirely justified. More's political philosophy during his years in power reflected orthodox medieval Christian teaching about authority and obedience. God had established earthly authorities to maintain order and administer justice, and subjects owed obedience to legitimate rulers as part of their obedience to God. Kings ruled by divine right, not in the sense that their power was unlimited, but in the sense that their authority came from God rather than from the people they ruled. The social hierarchy, king over nobles, nobles over commoners, men over women, parents over children, reflected divine order and shouldn't be casually disrupted by human speculation about alternative arrangements. Yet even as More defended royal authority in principle, he maintained subtle reservations about its scope and practice. He insisted that royal power was limited by divine law and by the ancient rites and customs of the realm. Kings couldn't legitimately command subjects to violate God's law, and subjects retained the right to passive resistance when royal commands contradicted divine commands. This limitation on royal authority seemed theoretical until Henry VIII's marriage crisis made it devastatingly practical. When Henry demanded that his subjects acknowledge his supremacy over the English Church and the legitimacy of his second marriage, More confronted the question of whether there were limits to political obedience that couldn't be crossed, regardless of the personal cost. The king's great matter, his determination to divorce Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn, created an impossible situation for More. Henry needed to dissolve his marriage to Catherine because after more than 20 years, she'd failed to produce a male heir and was now too old to do so. The king's solution was to argue that his marriage to Catherine had never been valid because she'd previously been married to his deceased brother Arthur, and biblical law prohibited such marriages. He demanded that the Pope annul the marriage, but the Pope, constrained by political pressure from Catherine's nephew, Emperor Charles V, refused. Henry's response was to reject papal authority over the English Church entirely. Through a series of parliamentary acts passed between 1532 and 1534, he declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, dissolved England's monasteries and confiscated their wealth, and required all subjects to swear an oath recognizing the validity of his marriage to Anne Boleyn and the supremacy of royal authority over ecclesiastical matters. This represented far more than a simple divorce. It was a complete restructuring of the relationship between spiritual and temporal authority that overturned 1,000 years of Christian tradition and practice. More's response was to resign as Lord Chancellor in 1532, officially citing health problems, but actually withdrawing from government service because he couldn't support the king's ecclesiastical policies. He then attempted to remain silent on the specific question of Henry's marriage and the royal supremacy, believing that silence couldn't be construed as opposition. He refused to attend Anne Boleyn's coronation, but sent a formal gift to maintain the appearance of proper respect. He avoided public comment on the marriage, while privately maintaining to family and close friends that he believed it was invalid. He was trying to navigate an impossible middle position, remaining loyal to the king's person while refusing to endorse the king's actions. This attempted neutrality reflected More's sophisticated understanding of both law and conscience. He recognized that the government couldn't compel positive affirmation of beliefs that contradicted conscience without violating fundamental principles of justice. Obedience could be demanded for actions, but belief was internal and therefore beyond the legitimate reach of temporal authority. As long as he maintained outward behavior that didn't positively challenge royal authority, he believed he should be left alone in his private convictions. This position was legally defensible, but politically naive. Henry VIII was not interested in legal technicalities when his authority was being challenged, and More's silence was interpreted as the eloquent resistance it actually was. Part 4. Conscience Against Power, the Tower and the Trial. More's arrest in April 1534 and his imprisonment in the Tower of London for refusing to swear the oath of succession represented the collision between two incompatible conceptions of authority. Henry VIII believed that political unity required religious unity and that subjects owed complete obedience to royal commands about both temporal and spiritual matters. More believed that conscience created obligations that political authority couldn't override, and that there were truths about the soul and salvation that lay beyond any king's jurisdiction. Neither man could compromise without betraying fundamental commitments, making the conflict between them tragic rather than merely political. The oath of succession required subjects to recognize the validity of Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn, the legitimacy of their children's claim to the throne, and the invalidity of Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. More was willing to swear to the succession itself. He accepted that Parliament had authority to determine who would inherit the crown. But the oath also included language that seemed to reject papal authority and affirm the king's supremacy over the church. This More could not accept because it contradicted what he believed to be divine truth preserved through church tradition. To swear this oath would be to commit perjury before God, and More believed that nothing in this world, including his own life, was worth the price of his eternal soul. The initial months of More's imprisonment were characterized by isolation and material deprivation that were severe even by Tower of London standards. His books and writing materials were confiscated, leaving him without the intellectual activity that had sustained him throughout his life. His family's visits were strictly limited and monitored. The tower was cold, damp, and dark, conditions that damaged More's already fragile health. But perhaps most difficult was the knowledge that his stance was causing suffering for his wife and children. His refusal to swear the oath meant that his property was forfeit to the crown, leaving his family impoverished and vulnerable. More's family mounted an emotional campaign to persuade him to swear the oath and save himself. His beloved daughter Margaret visited him in the tower and pleaded with him to consider his responsibilities to his family and the futility of his resistance. Every bishop in England, except John Fisher, had sworn the oath. The universities had accepted the royal supremacy. Continental powers had acquiesced to England's ecclesiastical independence. More's solitary opposition accomplished nothing except his own destruction and his family's ruin. Why not swear the oath with mental reservations, maintaining his private conviction while conforming publicly to royal demands? More's responses to these arguments revealed the philosophical and theological foundations of his resistance. He argued that conscience couldn't be divided between public and private spheres. A person who swore falsely to save his life was still committing perjury even if he maintained different beliefs privately. He insisted that majority opinion didn't determine truth, especially in matters of faith, where the consensus of Christian history carried more weight than the opinion of any particular generation. Most fundamentally, he maintained that no temporal advantage, including life itself, could justify betraying what one knew to be true. As he wrote to Margaret, "I have not been a man of such holy living as I might be bold to offer myself to death, lest God for my presumption might suffer me to fall. Howbeit, if God draw me to it himself, then trust I in his great mercy that he shall not fail to give me grace and strength." The legal proceedings against More demonstrated the government's determination to secure not just his compliance, but his public confession of error. Simply leaving him to die slowly in prison wouldn't serve Henry's purposes. It might even make More a martyr whose principled stand could inspire others to resist. The government needed to convict him of treason under the new statutes that made it treasonous to deny the royal supremacy, and conviction required proof that More had actively denied that supremacy rather than simply remaining silent about it. The prosecution's initial problem was that More had been extraordinarily careful in his words. He'd consistently refused to explain his reasons for not swearing the oath, saying only that his conscience wouldn't permit it. He'd avoided any positive assertion that the royal supremacy was wrong, or that the Pope retained authority over the English Church. His legal training had taught him that silence couldn't constitute a positive denial, and English common law held that silence should be interpreted favorably to the accused rather than presumed to indicate guilt. As long as More maintained this silence, he believed he couldn't be lawfully convicted. The government's solution was to manufacture evidence through perjured testimony. Richard Rich, the Solicitor General who had visited More in the Tower, ostensibly to confiscate his books, testified that More had explicitly denied the royal supremacy during their private conversation. Rich claimed that in response to a hypothetical question about whether Parliament could make the king supreme head of the church, More had stated that Parliament had no such authority because spiritual jurisdiction belonged to the church. More vehemently denied that this conversation had occurred, noting that it was implausible he would have confided in Rich, a man he knew to be untrustworthy, when he'd refused to explain his position to the king, his own family, or his closest friends. The trial itself was a legal travesty. More was denied adequate time to prepare his defense, prevented from calling witnesses who could testify to his character and credibility, and judged by commissioners who were essentially servants of the king rather than independent jurors. The verdict was predetermined by political necessity. Henry VIII needed More's conviction both to punish his resistance and to deter others from following his example. But the form of legal process had to be maintained because Henry wanted to appear as a just king enforcing legitimate laws rather than as a tyrant eliminating opposition. More's defense at trial revealed both his legal brilliance and his moral clarity. He demonstrated that Rich's testimony was implausible and contradicted by the testimony of other witnesses to the same conversation. He argued that even if he had made the statements Rich attributed to him, those statements were made in response to hypothetical questions and therefore couldn't constitute the malicious denial of the supremacy that the treason statute required. Most fundamentally, he challenged the legitimacy of the statute itself, arguing that Parliament couldn't validly legislate in spiritual matters and that no temporal authority could override the universal consensus of Christian tradition. This last argument was More's explicit defiance after months of careful silence. Once convicted, he had nothing left to lose by explaining his position fully. He argued that Henry's claim to supremacy over the English Church contradicted the practice and teaching of the universal church throughout Christian history. The church was by its nature universal, transcending national boundaries and temporal jurisdictions. No king could unilaterally declare independence from this universal body any more than one member of Parliament could unilaterally declare a particular city independent from the realm. The consensus of Christendom throughout its history carried infinitely more weight than the recent opinions of one country's parliament and king. More's speech challenged not just Henry's specific actions, but the fundamental principle of national sovereignty over religious matters. He was defending a medieval conception of Christendom as a unified civilization bound together by shared faith and ecclesiastical authority that transcended political boundaries. This conception was already dying in 1535. The Protestant Reformation had fractured Christian unity irreparably, and the future belonged to national churches and confessional states. But More believed that what was happening was wrong, regardless of whether it was inevitable, and that bearing witness to truth mattered even when resistance was futile. Part 5. The Execution and Its Meaning. Thomas More was beheaded on Tower Hill on July 6, 1535. The execution was delayed for several days, while the king considered whether clemency might serve his purposes better than More's death. But ultimately, Henry decided that More's example was too dangerous to let him live. The king did show one small mercy. He commuted the sentence from hanging, drawing, and quartering, the standard punishment for treason, to simple beheading. More's response to this news was characteristically witty. He thanked the king for sparing him the greater pain, but noted that the commutation actually denied him the opportunity to demonstrate greater fortitude. More's conduct on the day of execution embodied his peculiar combination of serene faith and ironic humor. He was so weak from his imprisonment that he needed assistance climbing the scaffold. Before placing his head on the block, he adjusted his beard carefully, joking that it at least had committed no treason and didn't deserve execution. He told the gathered crowd that he died the king's good servant, but God's first, a final assertion that his loyalty to Henry was genuine but subordinate to his loyalty to truth as he understood it. These gestures weren't mere bravado, but rather reflected More's genuine conviction that he was simply passing from one mode of existence to another, and that what awaited him was far better than what he was leaving behind. The immediate impact of More's execution was exactly what Henry intended. It terrorized potential opposition into silence. The message was clear. Not even the most learned, brilliant, and well-connected subjects were safe if they challenged the king's authority in religious matters. The monasteries were dissolved without significant resistance. The remaining bishops quickly accepted the royal supremacy. For a generation, English Catholicism went underground, its adherents practicing their faith in secret while outwardly conforming to whatever religious settlement the crown imposed. Henry had successfully established the principle that the crown controlled both temporal and spiritual matters within the realm. But the longer-term consequences of More's execution were far more ambiguous. His death created a martyr whose example would inspire Catholic resistance to Protestant monarchs throughout the following centuries. The fact that More had been willing to die rather than accept royal supremacy over the Church became powerful evidence that something fundamentally important was at stake in the question of ecclesiastical authority. Continental Catholics pointed to More's execution as proof that English Protestantism was imposed through violence rather than emerging from genuine religious conviction. English Catholics preserved More's memory as a hero of conscience against tyrannical power. More's legacy became contested terrain in the religious wars that followed his death. Protestants portrayed him as a persecutor of true religion who had gotten his just deserts when he found himself on the wrong side of royal power. They emphasized his aggressive prosecution of heretics and his crude polemical writings against Luther. Some suggested that his scrupulous conscience about the oath of supremacy was hypocritical, given his willingness to support burning people alive for religious disagreement. Catholics, by contrast, portrayed More as an exemplar of principled resistance to temporal tyranny over spiritual matters. They emphasized his learning, his charity, his devotion to family, and his final willingness to sacrifice everything for truth. The philosophical significance of More's final stand transcended these sectarian disputes. He'd confronted the fundamental question of whether there are truths and principles that political authority can't legitimately override, and whether individuals have the right or even the duty to resist when temporal power demands what conscience forbids. His answer was unambiguous. Legitimate political authority had limits, and those limits were defined by divine law and moral truth as preserved through tradition and accessible to conscience. When temporal authority transgressed those limits, obedience ceased to be a virtue and became instead a betrayal of higher obligations. This position created a paradox in More's political thought. Throughout his career in government, he defended royal authority and insisted on subjects' duty of obedience to their lawful sovereign. He'd prosecuted those who challenged ecclesiastical and temporal authority with severe harshness. He'd argued that social order required hierarchy and obedience, and that individuals couldn't simply follow their private judgments when those judgments conflicted with legitimate authority. Yet in the end, he'd done precisely what he'd punished others for doing. He'd placed his private conscience above the commands of legitimate authority. More would have rejected the charge of inconsistency by drawing crucial distinctions between kinds of authority and kinds of conscience. Royal authority was legitimate within its proper sphere, which included maintaining order, administering justice, and regulating temporal affairs. But it didn't extend to matters of faith and salvation, which belonged to the church. The heretics he'd prosecuted hadn't been following well-formed consciences based on careful study of scripture and tradition. They'd been following private whims that contradicted the consensus of Christian teaching. His own resistance wasn't based on private judgment, but rather on the universal teaching of the church, against which one king's idiosyncratic claims carried no weight. But these distinctions, however plausible to More, couldn't resolve the fundamental problem his case revealed. Who decides where legitimate authority ends and illegitimate demands begin? Who determines which conscientious convictions deserve protection and which represent mere private obstinacy? More believed that church tradition and universal Christian consensus provided objective standards that could answer these questions. But Protestants denied that church tradition carried such authority, arguing that Scripture alone was the proper standard. And even among Catholics, there was disagreement about how to apply traditional teaching to novel situations like Henry's claim to supremacy over the English Church. The political philosophy that emerged from More's martyrdom thus pointed in multiple directions simultaneously. For defenders of individual conscience, More became a hero of principled resistance to tyrannical authority, demonstrating that some things matter more than life itself, and that individuals have the right to defy unjust laws. For defenders of traditional authority, More became a martyr for the principle that spiritual truths transcend temporal power and that the church must retain independence from state control. For skeptics about both individual conscience and institutional authority, More's case demonstrated the tragic consequences of irreconcilable convictions and the impossibility of peaceful coexistence when fundamental values collide. Part 6. More's Theory of Law and Justice. More's legal career and his final confrontation with royal power together illuminate his sophisticated understanding of law's nature and limitations. As a brilliant lawyer who rose to become Lord Chancellor, he understood how legal systems actually functioned, rather than how they ideally should function. He knew that law was simultaneously a framework for justice and a tool of power, that legal reasoning could discover genuine truth, but could also be manipulated to serve unjust purposes, and that the relationship between positive law, what the authorities actually command, and natural law, what justice requires, was complex and often troubled. The foundation of More's legal philosophy was his conviction that human law derived its legitimacy from conformity with divine law and natural justice. Laws that contradicted these higher standards weren't genuinely law at all, regardless of how they were enacted or who promulgated them. This didn't mean that subjects could simply disobey any law they personally disagreed with. Established authority deserved presumptive obedience, and social order required that minor injustices be tolerated rather than resisted. But it did mean that there were limits beyond which positive law lost its claim to obedience, and that grossly unjust laws could and should be opposed even at great personal cost. More's judicial career demonstrated his commitment to administering existing law fairly even when he disagreed with it in principle. As Lord Chancellor, he presided over the Court of Chancery, which could provide equitable relief when the strict application of common law rules would produce unjust results. More was famous for his efficiency in clearing the court's massive backlog of cases and for his even-handedness in judgment. He refused bribes, treated poor litigants with the same respect as wealthy ones, and based his decisions on careful legal analysis rather than political considerations or personal favoritism. This judicial integrity earned him respect even from those who disagreed with his religious and political views. But More also understood that law could be corrupted through technical manipulation even when its substantive provisions remained formally just. The proliferation of lawyers and legal complexity in Tudor England meant that wealth increasingly determined legal outcomes, because only the wealthy could afford sophisticated legal representation. The law of property was particularly problematic because it protected existing distributions of land and wealth regardless of how those distributions had been originally acquired. Criminal law was applied selectively, with poor defendants regularly hanged for minor thefts, while wealthy defendants used legal technicalities to escape punishment for serious crimes. These systematic injustices weren't anomalies, but rather features of how legal systems actually operated. More's critique of law's corruption appeared most explicitly in Utopia, where the utopians had deliberately simplified their legal system to make justice accessible to ordinary people. They had no lawyers because they believed that legal advocacy inevitably obscured rather than revealed truth. They limited property law because private property created most of the disputes that required legal resolution. They minimized criminal punishment because they understood that crime was usually produced by social conditions rather than individual wickedness. This radical critique suggested that More recognized law's profound limitations as a means to justice, that perhaps genuine justice required social transformation that would make much of what law did unnecessary. The relationship between law and conscience was particularly important for understanding More's final position. He maintained throughout his imprisonment that silence couldn't be construed as denial under proper legal interpretation. English common law held that criminal intent had to be proved through affirmative acts or statements, and mere refusal to make a statement shouldn't be interpreted as implying any particular belief. More's silence was therefore legally protected. He had the right to remain silent about his reasons for refusing the oath, without that silence being used as evidence of treasonous intent. But the government essentially changed the rules, first by creating new treason statutes that arguably made mere denial of the supremacy treasonous, even without malicious intent, and then by manufacturing evidence through Rich's perjured testimony. More's response was to insist that such manipulation of law destroyed law's legitimacy. If legal forms could be twisted to produce predetermined results, regardless of truth or justice, then law became merely a mask for arbitrary power rather than a genuine constraint on authority. His willingness to die, rather than acquiesce to this legal travesty, was thus a defense of law itself against its corruption by politics. More's legal philosophy also addressed the problem of legal change and reform. He wasn't a simple conservative who believed that existing laws and customs should never be modified. He recognized that social conditions changed and that laws needed to adapt accordingly. But he insisted that such adaptation should occur gradually through processes that maintained continuity with legal tradition rather than through revolutionary breaks that destroyed established expectations and relationships. The problem with Henry VIII's ecclesiastical legislation wasn't just its content, but also its method. It represented a fundamental rupture with centuries of legal tradition that eliminated the restraints and protections that made law something other than royal whim. The theoretical foundations of More's jurisprudence drew on both classical and medieval sources. From Aristotle and Cicero, he inherited the concept of natural law, the idea that human reason could discover principles of justice that transcended particular legal systems and that provided standards for evaluating positive law. From Thomas Aquinas and other medieval theorists, he inherited the concept of law as participation in eternal reason, with human law deriving legitimacy from its conformity with divine law and natural justice. These intellectual frameworks gave More confidence that his resistance to Henry's laws wasn't merely personal obstinacy, but rather defense of principles accessible to reason and confirmed by tradition. But More's legal thought also contained tensions that he never fully resolved. He believed in the importance of legal certainty and the need for established procedures and precedents, yet he also served as chancellor in equity, where he could override strict legal rules when they produced unjust results. He believed that law required interpretation by learned experts, yet he criticized the legal profession's tendency to mystify law and make it inaccessible to ordinary people. He believed in the duty of obedience to established authority, yet he died defying that authority when it commanded what he believed to be wrong. These tensions reflected genuine difficulties in legal philosophy that can't be eliminated through better theory, but rather must be negotiated in practice. Part 7. More's humanist learning and its contradictions. More's identity as a humanist scholar shaped every aspect of his life and thought. He belonged to that remarkable generation of Northern European intellectuals who believed that recovering and studying ancient Greek and Roman texts could transform contemporary society by providing access to wisdom that centuries of medieval commentary had obscured. Yet More's humanism was distinctively different from the Italian humanism that inspired it, more closely integrated with Christian piety and more skeptical about human capacity for self-directed moral improvement. Understanding More's particular brand of Christian humanism is essential for grasping both his greatest achievements and his most troubling failures. The humanist educational program that More championed emphasized the studia humanitatis, grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, and moral philosophy studied through careful reading of classical texts. This education was intended to produce not just learned individuals, but virtuous citizens who could apply ancient wisdom to contemporary problems. The assumption was that exposure to classical examples of virtue and vice would shape character, while training in rhetoric would enable the educated to persuade others toward virtuous action. The goal wasn't abstract knowledge, but practical wisdom that would translate into better lives and better government. More's household embodied this humanist educational ideal. His children received the same intensive classical training that young men in humanist schools received, with the notable addition that his daughters participated fully in this education. rather than being limited to domestic training. Margaret Moore's scholarly achievements proved that women could excel in the studia humanitatis when given opportunity and encouragement. The presence of learned conversation, classical readings, and intellectual games in Moore's household made it a model that other humanists praised and tried to emulate. But Moore's humanist optimism about education's power to shape character coexisted uneasily with his increasingly dark assessment of human nature after the fall. The early humanists had believed that human beings were basically rational and that education could reliably produce virtue by developing reason and providing moral exemplars. Moore came to believe that the corruption introduced by original sin ran too deep for education alone to overcome. Without grace, even the most extensive classical education might produce learned scoundrels rather than virtuous citizens. The proliferation of educated heretics proved that learning could be turned to evil purposes as easily as good ones. Moore's polemical writings against the Protestant reformers revealed the tension between humanist method and theological conviction. As a humanist, he believed in dialogue, reasoned argument, and the careful examination of texts to discover meaning. Yet his anti-Protestant polemics were often vitriolic personal attacks that relied more on ridicule than rational argument. He called his opponents names, attributed base motives to them, and showed little interest in actually understanding their theological positions. This style was partly strategic. He was writing for popular audiences who would be more moved by insult than syllogism. But it also reflected genuine anger at what he saw as the destructive consequences of Protestant teaching. The contradiction appeared most clearly in Moore's attitude toward vernacular scripture. As a humanist, he believed in making texts accessible and had himself translated and written works in English rather than Latin. He recognized that lay people could benefit from reading scripture in their own language rather than depending entirely on clerical interpretation. Yet he also feared that uncontrolled vernacular scripture would lead to heretical interpretation and social disorder. His solution was to support carefully controlled translation that would be authorized by ecclesiastical authority and explained through approved commentary. But this position, essentially, abandoned the humanist confidence in the individual reader's capacity to understand texts through careful study. Moore's relationship with Erasmus embodied these humanist contradictions. Erasmus was Moore's closest intellectual friend and his partner in the humanist project of renewing Christian learning through return to scriptural and patristic sources. Erasmus's Greek New Testament and his editions of the Church Fathers provided the textual foundations that Moore and other Northern humanists built upon. Erasmus's satires of ecclesiastical corruption, particularly the Praise of Folly, which was dedicated to Moore and punned on his name, used humanist learning to criticize the very institutions that humanists depended upon for patronage and protection. Yet as the Protestant Reformation developed, Moore and Erasmus diverged in their responses. Erasmus maintained his commitment to dialogue and his hope that reasoned discussion could resolve theological disputes without schism. He criticized both Protestant innovations and Catholic resistance to reform, trying to occupy a middle position that would preserve Christian unity while addressing legitimate criticisms of church practice. Moore became increasingly convinced that Protestantism was too dangerous to be tolerated, and that maintaining Catholic unity required suppressing rather than debating with heretics. Where Erasmus saw theological disagreements that could be resolved through better scholarship and clearer thinking, More saw existential threats to Christian civilization that required forceful suppression. This divergence reflected different assessments of human nature and the power of reason. Erasmus maintained the humanist optimism that reason and education could overcome error, and that people of goodwill could reach agreement through careful discussion. More came to believe that sin had so corrupted human reason that theological truth could only be preserved through institutional authority backed by force. Individual judgment, no matter how learned or well-intentioned, was insufficient and dangerous when exercised independently of church teaching. The humanist program of individual study and judgment needed to be subordinated to ecclesiastical authority. More's scholarly work itself embodied these tensions. His early writings, including his translations of Greek texts and his verses, showed typical humanist delight in linguistic skill and classical learning. His history of King Richard III demonstrated humanist historical method, using classical models while paying careful attention to sources and psychological motivation. Utopia represented humanist social criticism at its finest, using classical learning to imagine radical alternatives to contemporary practice. But his later polemical works largely abandoned humanist method in favor of authoritarian assertion and personal attack. The question of whether More betrayed his humanist principles or simply applied them more rigorously as circumstances changed remains contested. His defenders argue that he remained faithful to Christian humanism's core commitment, that classical learning should serve Christian truth rather than challenging it. When he saw humanist methods being used to undermine Catholic teaching, he responded by subordinating humanism to theological orthodoxy, which was entirely consistent with his fundamental priorities. His critics argue that he abandoned the humanist commitment to dialogue, textual study, and rational argument when those methods produced conclusions he disagreed with, revealing that his humanism had always been superficial or instrumental. Perhaps the most charitable interpretation is that More experienced genuine tragedy. His humanist confidence in reason's power to discover and persuade others of truth collided with the reality of deep theological disagreement that couldn't be resolved through dialogue. Rather than accepting that reasonable people could reach different conclusions about fundamental questions, he concluded that disagreement must reflect either stupidity, wickedness, or corruption. This conclusion led him to abandon dialogue in favor of suppression, but it emerged from disappointed idealism rather than cynical abandonment of principle. Part 8. The Theology of Conscience and Authority. More's final stand against Henry VIII forced him to articulate a theology of conscience that remains philosophically and theologically significant. He had to explain how individual conscience could be binding even in opposition to apparently legitimate authority, yet also maintain that not every claim of conscience deserved protection or respect. The position he developed was sophisticated, but also revealed deep tensions in Christian political thought that couldn't be fully resolved. The foundation of More's theology of conscience was the principle that conscience represents the individual's relationship with God and ultimate truth. Conscience wasn't simply subjective preference or personal opinion. It was the faculty through which human beings recognized and responded to moral truth. A well-formed conscience, educated through study of Scripture and tradition, and refined through prayer and moral discipline, could reliably distinguish right from wrong. To act against such a conscience was to sin, even if the action was otherwise permitted or commanded by legitimate authority, but more sharply distinguished between well-formed and erroneous conscience. A well-formed conscience was educated through church teaching, tested against the consensus of Christian tradition, and submitted to ecclesiastical authority for correction if it seemed to conflict with orthodox teaching. An erroneous conscience was one that elevated personal judgment above church teaching, or that accepted novel interpretations that contradicted traditional understanding. The Protestant reformers, in More's view, were following erroneous consciences that mistook pride for principle and personal opinion for divine truth. This distinction created an obvious problem. How could one determine whether a particular conscientious position reflected well-formed or erroneous conscience? More's answer was that conformity with church teaching and the consensus of Christian history provided the test. If your conscience told you something that contradicted what the church had always taught, then your conscience was wrong and needed correction. But this answer simply relocated the problem. What happened when church authorities themselves disagreed, or when established teaching seemed to conflict with Scripture or reason? More confronted this problem directly in his resistance to Henry VIII. The king argued that Parliament, representing the community of the realm, had the same authority to determine church governance within England that the church universally claimed. More argued that no temporal authority, not even a Christian king advised by Parliament, could override the universal consensus of Christendom on spiritual matters. But how could one practically distinguish between legitimate adaptation of church governance to local circumstances, which had always been accepted, and illegitimate schism from the universal church, which More believed Henry's supremacy represented? More's answer drew on his understanding of law and legal interpretation. The church, like any legal system, could adapt its discipline and governance to different circumstances while maintaining doctrinal unity. But certain fundamental principles couldn't be altered without destroying the integrity of the system itself. Papal primacy and the Church's independence from temporal control fell into this category of non-negotiable fundamentals. These weren't merely human traditions that could be revised at will, but rather were founded in Scripture and confirmed by consistent Christian practice throughout history. But even this answer raised difficulties. Protestants argued that papal primacy wasn't actually biblical, and that the early church hadn't recognized papal supremacy in the form claimed by medieval and Renaissance popes. They pointed to Eastern Orthodox Christianity, which rejected papal authority while maintaining apostolic succession and traditional doctrine. They suggested that the consensus More appealed to was actually a medieval innovation that had corrupted the simpler structure of the early church. More insisted that patristic texts and church councils confirmed papal authority, and that Orthodox rejection of Rome was itself schismatic. But these were historical and interpretive questions that couldn't be definitively resolved through more careful study of the evidence. The theological foundations of More's position drew heavily on Thomas Aquinas and medieval scholasticism. Aquinas had argued that human law derived its binding force from conformity with natural law, which in turn participated in eternal law. When human law contradicted natural and eternal law, it ceased to be genuine law and lost its claim to obedience. But Aquinas had also emphasized the importance of established authority and had insisted that subjects shouldn't resist legitimate rulers except in cases of extreme and manifest injustice. More believed that Henry's claim to supremacy over the church met this high bar for justified resistance. More's sacramental theology also shaped his understanding of conscience and authority. The Catholic teaching on sacraments held that they conferred grace objectively, ex opere operato, when properly administered, regardless of the worthiness of the minister or the subjective state of the recipient. This meant that the Church's authority to administer sacraments was essential for salvation. There was no direct, unmediated relationship between individual believers and God that could substitute for sacramental grace mediated through the Church. To separate the English Church from papal authority was therefore to sever English Christians from the sacramental system that made salvation possible. This sacramental understanding made More's resistance simultaneously more comprehensible and more troubling. It was comprehensible because it meant that he wasn't merely defending institutional prerogatives or traditional practices, but rather protecting what he believed was necessary for eternal salvation. It was troubling because it meant that More believed Henry was damning not just himself, but all English Christians who followed him in schism. This apocalyptic stakes explained the desperation of More's resistance. He wasn't dying for a principle, but rather to witness against apostasy. Yet More's emphasis on conscience also contained the seeds of more individualist and potentially subversive principles. If conscience was ultimately answerable only to God and truth, and if individuals had the right and duty to resist commands that violated conscience, then in principle, anyone could claim conscientious grounds for resistance. More tried to limit this subversive potential by insisting that conscience had to be formed by church teaching and confirmed by Christian tradition. But the example of his own resistance demonstrated that individuals could judge even their legitimate sovereigns to be wrong on fundamental matters, and this example could inspire resistance that More himself would have condemned. Part 9. More's economic thought and social criticism. More's economic thinking, most fully expressed in Utopia but evident throughout his work, offered a fundamental challenge to the emerging market society of early modern Europe. He questioned whether the new economic arrangements that were enriching merchants and landowners were actually making society more prosperous and happier, or whether they were simply redistributing wealth in ways that benefited the few at the expense of the many. His analysis anticipated many of the criticisms that later thinkers would make of capitalism while remaining grounded in medieval Christian assumptions about the purpose of economic activity. The foundation of More's economic thought was his conviction that the purpose of economic activity was to provide for genuine human needs rather than to accumulate wealth for its own sake. In a properly ordered society, economic arrangements would ensure that all members had access to the material necessities required for decent lives: adequate food, clothing, shelter, and the leisure necessary for intellectual and spiritual development. The accumulation of surplus wealth beyond what was needed for these purposes was at best pointless, and at worst actively harmful, because it encouraged pride, envy, and the exploitation of others. More's critique of enclosure was particularly pointed. Throughout the 16th century, English landowners were converting arable land used for grain production into pasture for sheep, because wool production was more profitable in the expanding international trade. This enclosure movement dispossessed thousands of tenant farmers who had traditional rights to work the land, forcing them into vagabondage and crime. More famously wrote that sheep were devouring men, that the pursuit of profit was literally destroying the social fabric that had provided security and community for generations. The economic system described in Utopia directly addressed these problems through the abolition of private property and money. Without private ownership of land, enclosure became impossible. Without money, the accumulation of wealth for its own sake became impossible. Work was organized collectively to meet community needs rather than individual profit. The result was both greater material equality and also greater happiness, because people weren't driven by artificial needs and competitive anxieties. The Utopians worked shorter hours than Europeans and had more time for intellectual and cultural activities, yet they produced abundance because their labor was efficiently organized and not wasted on luxury goods. But More's economic vision in Utopia wasn't simply redistributive egalitarianism. The Utopians maintained social distinctions based on learning, wisdom, and contribution to the community. Scholars were exempt from physical labor so they could pursue studies that benefited everyone. Magistrates were chosen from among the learned and exercised authority over others. This suggested that More believed in natural hierarchy based on virtue and ability rather than in complete leveling. The problem with European economic arrangements wasn't inequality per se, but rather that inequality was based on inherited wealth and property ownership rather than merit and service. More's economic thought also reflected distinctively Christian concerns about the spiritual dangers of wealth. Christ had warned that it was easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. The early Christian community described in Acts had held property in common, with members contributing according to ability and receiving according to need. The monastic orders practiced voluntary poverty and communal ownership. These biblical and traditional sources suggested that private property was at best a concession to human sinfulness rather than a positive good, and that Christian society should minimize rather than celebrate wealth accumulation. Yet More's own economic behavior contradicted his theoretical critique of property and wealth. He accumulated considerable wealth through his legal practice and royal service. He maintained a large household with numerous servants. He purchased his country estate at Chelsea, which was by no means modest. When he resigned as Lord Chancellor, he faced financial difficulties, but this was because he'd been living at a level appropriate to his position rather than practicing voluntary poverty. This apparent hypocrisy has troubled More's admirers and delighted his critics. More would probably have responded that he never claimed to practice heroic virtue, and that living according to conventional expectations while occupying positions of responsibility was different from imagining how society might be better organized. His acceptance of private property in practice didn't mean he believed it was ideally just, only that it was the existing social arrangement within which he had to operate. By analogy, one might believe that monarchy is inferior to democracy, while still loyally serving a monarch in a monarchical system. The point of Utopia wasn't to provide a blueprint for his personal life, but rather to generate critical reflection on European social organization. More's analysis of poverty and crime showed sophisticated understanding of how economic arrangements shaped social behavior. He recognized that most crime was driven by material necessity rather than moral failure. People stole because they were hungry, not because they were inherently wicked. The solution to crime wasn't more severe punishment. The problem with European justice wasn't that thieves weren't punished harshly enough, but rather that the punishment didn't address the underlying causes of criminal behavior. Hanging more thieves simply meant more executions without reducing theft. Real solutions required economic reforms that would eliminate the desperation that drove people to crime. This analysis extended to More's understanding of social class and opportunity. He recognized that birth largely determined life outcomes in European society. Children born to wealthy families received education, made advantageous marriages, and inherited property that would provide comfortable lives regardless of their talents or efforts. Children born to poor families received no education, had no marriage prospects, and inherited nothing, condemned to lives of hard labor regardless of their potential abilities. This system wasted human capacity and created unnecessary misery by failing to match people's talents with appropriate social roles. The utopian solution was systematic education for all children, with the most talented identified and given advanced training regardless of parentage. Social roles were assigned based on ability and contribution rather than birth. This meritocratic organization served both justice and efficiency. It was more fair to individuals and also produced better social outcomes by ensuring that the most capable people filled the most important positions. More thus anticipated modern meritocratic ideals, while remaining skeptical about whether such systems could actually be implemented given human tendencies toward nepotism and status seeking. Part 10. More's literary art and rhetorical strategy. More's significance as a writer matches his importance as a philosopher and martyr. He was a master of multiple literary forms: dialogue, satire, polemic, translation, verse, history, and spiritual meditation. And he used each form strategically to achieve particular intellectual and rhetorical purposes. Understanding More's literary art is essential for understanding his thought, because the form of his arguments was inseparable from their content. He believed that truth needed to be presented in ways that would engage readers emotionally and imaginatively, as well as intellectually. The dialogue form that More used in Utopia and other works had ancient precedents in Plato's philosophical dialogues and Cicero's rhetorical treatises. But More adapted the form for his own purposes in ways that created distinctive effects. His dialogues didn't simply present opposing positions that one side defeats through superior argument. Instead, they created genuine ambiguity by giving both sides plausible arguments and by refusing to identify the author's own position definitively with any single speaker. Readers were forced to think through the issues themselves rather than passively accepting conclusions. The character structure in Utopia embodied this ambiguity. Raphael Hythloday, whose surname means speaker of nonsense in Greek, is simultaneously an unreliable narrator whose judgments can't be trusted, and a clear-sighted critic whose observations expose European social corruption. More, the character, is simultaneously a reasonable skeptic who raises legitimate objections to utopian arrangements, and a conventional thinker too attached to existing practices to imagine genuine alternatives. Neither character represents More the author completely, and readers must synthesize insights from both perspectives while recognizing limitations in each. More's satirical writing showed his debt to classical models, particularly Lucian, whose dialogues More had translated. The satire operated through ironic inversion, describing ideal arrangements that implicitly criticized existing practices or describing existing practices in ways that revealed their absurdity. The utopian's amazement that Europeans use gold for chamber pots satirized European obsession with gold and jewels. The description of European criminal justice as barbaric when viewed from utopian perspective revealed its actual barbarity while ostensibly defending it. This indirect approach was more effective than direct criticism would have been because it forced readers to see familiar practices from an unfamiliar perspective. More's polemical writings against Protestant reformers employed completely different rhetorical strategies than his earlier humanist works. Where utopia was subtle and ambiguous, the polemics were blunt and combative. Where the earlier works invited reflection, the polemics demanded assent. This shift in style reflected More's assessment that Protestant theology was too dangerous to be addressed through humanist dialogue and gentle persuasion. It also reflected the conventions of 16th century religious controversy, where personal attack and ridicule were standard weapons in theological debate. Yet even the polemics showed literary sophistication. More used heavy sarcasm and rhetorical questions to reduce opponents' positions to absurdity. He created memorable insults and epithets that stuck in readers' minds. He structured his arguments carefully, appearing to address opponents' actual positions while systematically misrepresenting them in ways that made them easier to defeat. He mixed learned theological argument with crude jokes and personal attacks to appeal to both educated and popular audiences. These techniques were effective in the short term, but damaged More's reputation in the longer term by making him appear intolerant and unreasonable. More's historical writing, particularly his History of King Richard III, showed humanist influence in its attention to psychological motivation and its use of invented speeches to reveal character. But it also anticipated modern historical method in its careful use of sources and its attempt to distinguish reliable from unreliable testimony. The portrait of Richard as a complex figure driven by ambition and insecurity rather than simply evil showed More's understanding that historical explanation required understanding human psychology. The famous description of Richard as physically deformed reflected not More's belief that evil produced physical ugliness, though that was a common medieval assumption, but rather his use of physical description to symbolize moral character. More's letters, particularly those written from the Tower of London to his daughter Margaret, achieved a distinctive voice that combined intellectual seriousness with emotional warmth. These weren't formal literary productions intended for publication, but rather genuine communications between people who loved each other deeply. Yet they also served as vehicles for articulating and defending More's theological and political positions to his family, and potentially to wider audiences if the letters were preserved and shared. The combination of personal intimacy and public significance gave these letters special power. They showed that More's principles weren't abstract philosophical commitments, but rather deeply held convictions that shaped his most important relationships. More's final writings in the Tower showed spiritual depth and literary skill, despite being produced under severe physical and emotional distress. His dialogue of comfort against tribulation, written while he awaited trial and execution, meditated on how faith could sustain people through suffering and fear of death. It drew on classical philosophy, biblical wisdom, and personal experience to construct a Christian stoicism that acknowledged the reality of suffering while insisting that temporary tribulation was insignificant compared to eternal joy. The work succeeded because it wasn't merely theoretical, but emerged from More's own struggle to maintain faith and courage in the face of approaching death. More's use of humor throughout his works, including his final witticisms on the scaffold, revealed his conviction that wit and laughter weren't incompatible with serious moral purpose. The jokes weren't attempts to trivialize important matters, but rather expressions of confidence that death wasn't the ultimate reality, and that earthly sufferings could be viewed with perspective. The ability to joke while facing execution demonstrated More's genuine faith that he was passing from this life to something infinitely better. The humor also served rhetorical purposes. It made More's final witness more memorable and showed that dying for conscience didn't require grim solemnity. Part 11. More and the Renaissance Ideal of the Complete Person. Thomas. More embodied the Renaissance ideal of the universal man, the person who excelled in multiple fields and who integrated intellectual achievement with moral virtue and practical effectiveness. He was simultaneously a leading lawyer, a brilliant scholar, a witty writer, a devoted family man, a capable administrator, and ultimately a martyr for conscience. This combination of excellences made him the model of what humanist education was supposed to produce. The person whose developed capacities served both personal flourishing and the common good. More's legal eminence was undisputed. He became one of London's leading lawyers through a combination of brilliant legal analysis, persuasive rhetoric, and absolute integrity. Clients sought him out because they trusted both his competence and his honesty. His judicial service as Lord Chancellor earned respect even from those who disagreed with his religious views, because he administered the law fairly without favoritism or corruption. This professional achievement wasn't separate from his humanist learning, but rather showed how classical education could be applied to practical professional work. More's scholarly accomplishments would have been impressive even if he'd done nothing else with his life. His translations from Greek exposed English readers to classical texts they couldn't otherwise have accessed. His editions of patristic works contributed to the textual scholarship that characterized Northern humanism. His polemical writings, whatever their flaws, showed comprehensive knowledge of theology and church history. His Utopia became one of the most influential works of political philosophy ever written. This scholarly productivity was achieved despite demanding professional responsibilities and active family life. More typically, rose before dawn to work on his writings before beginning his legal and administrative duties for the day. More's family life modeled humanist ideals about how learning should be integrated with domestic relationships. His insistence on educating his daughters equally with his son challenged conventional assumptions about female intellectual capacity. His household became a kind of informal academy where learning was pursued collectively through conversation, reading, and intellectual games. The warm relationships within the family showed that intellectual achievement didn't require sacrificing emotional bonds or treating family relationships as distractions from serious work. Scholarship could be a shared activity that enriched family life rather than isolating the scholar from human connection. More's administrative competence demonstrated that scholarly learning produced practical wisdom that could be applied to political affairs. As a royal counselor and Lord Chancellor, he handled complex diplomatic negotiations, supervised legal reform, and administered the realm's highest court. He brought the same analytical skills to political problems that he brought to scholarly questions, and he maintained the same integrity in political service that he demonstrated in legal practice. This showed that humanist education wasn't merely ornamental, but rather provided skills and perspectives that could improve government and serve the common good. Yet More's attempt to integrate these multiple excellences also revealed tensions that couldn't be fully resolved. The time devoted to scholarship was time not available for legal work or family life. The compromises required by political service sometimes conflicted with scholarly integrity or religious principle. The responsibilities of family life limited the kind of radical commitment that spiritual perfection might require. More managed these tensions through extraordinary discipline and by maintaining clear priorities. He knew what mattered most and what could be sacrificed when necessary. More's personality combined qualities that don't usually coexist. He was simultaneously serious and witty, disciplined and playful, confident and humble, worldly and spiritual. His famous sense of humor didn't diminish his moral seriousness, but rather complemented it by preventing that seriousness from becoming oppressive self-righteousness. His worldly success didn't produce arrogance because he maintained perspective about the ultimate insignificance of earthly achievements. His deep learning didn't make him contemptuous of those with less education because he recognized that moral worth and intellectual accomplishment weren't identical. The secret hair shirt that More wore beneath his fine robes symbolized this integration of opposites. Outwardly, he lived as his position required, wearing expensive clothes, maintaining an impressive household, participating in court magnificence. Inwardly, he maintained the ascetic discipline of a monk, constantly reminding himself of mortality and practicing self-denial. This combination wasn't hypocrisy, but rather recognition that different aspects of life required different practices, and that external conformity to social expectations was compatible with internal spiritual discipline. More's friendships showed his capacity for deep human connection alongside intellectual companionship. His relationship with Erasmus was both a scholarly partnership and a genuine friendship characterized by mutual affection and loyalty. His friendships with other humanists created a network of learned conversation that enriched everyone involved. His ability to maintain these friendships despite political and theological disagreements showed his capacity to separate intellectual debate from personal animosity, at least until the Protestant Reformation made such separation impossible. But More's exemplary character also contained moral blind spots that trouble modern observers. His prosecution of heretics showed cruelty that contradicted his reputation for kindness and compassion. His polemical writings displayed hatred and intolerance that contradicted humanist ideals of dialogue and rational persuasion. His defense of Catholic wealth and privilege contradicted his theoretical critique of property and inequality. These failures suggest either that More's integration of virtue was less complete than it appeared, or that the contradictions reflected genuine dilemmas in Christian humanism that couldn't be resolved at the individual level. Part 12. The problem of religious violence and intolerance. More's role in persecuting Protestant heretics remains the most troubling aspect of his legacy. As Lord Chancellor, he used his authority to pursue suspected Protestants with zeal. He personally interrogated heretics, authorized their torture, and participated in proceedings that led to several executions. His polemical writings defended burning heretics as not only legitimate, but necessary for protecting Christian society. This record of intolerance and cruelty seems incompatible with More's reputation for wisdom, compassion, and moral integrity, creating a problem that his admirers have struggled to explain, while his critics have seized upon as proof of fundamental hypocrisy. The theological foundations of More's position on heresy reflected Orthodox Catholic teaching that had developed over centuries. Heresy wasn't simply mistaken belief, but rather spiritual poison that could contaminate others and lead them to eternal damnation. Just as civil authorities had the right and duty to protect subjects from physical threats, they had even greater obligation to protect subjects from spiritual threats that endangered immortal souls. The limited suffering caused by executing a few heretics was justified if it prevented the far greater suffering of countless souls corrupted by heretical teaching. This argument drew on an analogy between bodily and spiritual health. A surgeon amputates gangrenous limbs to prevent infection from spreading through the body and killing the patient. The immediate suffering caused by amputation is justified by the greater suffering it prevents. Similarly, executing heretics prevents spiritual infection from spreading through the social body and damning large numbers of souls. The heretic's suffering is limited to temporary physical pain, while the souls saved from heresy avoid eternal torment. From this perspective, burning heretics was actually an act of love, harsh love that accepted immediate suffering to prevent greater harm. More also argued that religious toleration would inevitably lead to social disorder and ultimately civil war. Once people were allowed to follow their private judgments about religious truth, the bonds that held society together would dissolve. Every individual would become their own authority, rejecting any teaching that conflicted with personal preference. The result would be religious fragmentation, social conflict, and the eventual breakdown of civilized life. The only way to maintain social peace was to enforce religious uniformity through whatever means were necessary, including violence against those who threatened that uniformity. Historical evidence seemed to support More's fears. The Peasants' War in Germany, where Protestant theology mixed with social grievances to produce violent uprising, showed that religious innovation could spark revolution. The proliferation of Protestant sects, each claiming exclusive possession of divine truth while condemning all others, demonstrated that once the principle of private judgment was accepted, there was no logical stopping point before complete religious chaos. The developing pattern of religious warfare in Europe suggested that religious diversity and social peace were incompatible. Yet More's position on heresy also contradicted important strands in his own thought. The religious tolerance described in Utopia suggested he'd once believed that people with different religious beliefs could coexist peacefully as long as they maintained basic moral standards and didn't try to impose their views on others violently. His humanist commitment to dialogue and rational persuasion seemed incompatible with using violence to enforce intellectual conformity. His own courageous resistance to political authorities' demands in spiritual matters suggested recognition that conscience sometimes required defying established power. Yet he denied that same right to Protestants who claimed to be following their consciences. More attempted to resolve these contradictions by distinguishing between different kinds of religious situations and different kinds of conscientious claims. Utopia described a pagan society that had never received Christian revelation. In such a society, toleration made sense because no one possessed revealed truth that imposed obligations on others. But once Christian revelation had been received and preserved through church tradition, rejecting that revelation wasn't a legitimate exercise of conscience, but rather a rebellion against known truth. Protestant claims to be following conscience were invalid because their consciences were malformed by pride, ignorance, or willful rejection of authority. This distinction preserved logical consistency, but at the cost of rendering More's position essentially unfalsifiable. Any disagreement with Catholic teaching could be dismissed as reflecting erroneous rather than genuine conscience, and any claim to be following conscience in opposition to church authority could be rejected as spiritual pride masquerading as religious conviction. The test for distinguishing genuine from erroneous conscience was simply conformity with Catholic teaching, which meant that conscientious objection to Catholicism was impossible by definition. This circular reasoning made meaningful dialogue impossible and provided ready justification for suppressing any religious dissent. More's personal involvement in heresy prosecutions went beyond the theological defense of such prosecutions in principle to active participation in particular cases. He interrogated suspected heretics, attempting to trap them in statements that would prove their heterodoxy. He authorized torture in several cases to extract confessions or information about other heretics. He used his influence to ensure that heresy trials resulted in convictions and executions. His house at Chelsea apparently served at times as a location for detaining suspected heretics. These actions suggest not merely intellectual commitment to anti-heresy policies, but rather personal zeal in implementing them. More later denied some of the specific charges made against him regarding his treatment of heretics, claiming that he'd never tortured anyone in his house and that he'd been less severe than his accusers claimed. But he never expressed regret about his role in heresy prosecutions or questioned whether executing people for religious belief was justified. To the end of his life, he maintained that heretics deserved death and that enforcing religious uniformity through violence was legitimate and necessary. This unwavering commitment suggests that More didn't see his anti-heresy activities as regrettable necessities, but rather as righteous actions that served God and protected society. The parallel between More's prosecution of heretics and his own subsequent prosecution for religious nonconformity is obvious and troubling. More was executed for following his conscience in opposition to royal authorities' religious demands. Yet he'd participated in executing Protestants who claimed to be following their consciences in opposition to Catholic authorities' religious demands. The government's arguments for More's execution, that religious unity was necessary for social order, that individual conscience couldn't override legitimate authority, that tolerating dissent would encourage rebellion, precisely mirrored More's own arguments for executing Protestants. More apparently didn't recognize this parallel, or at least didn't acknowledge it publicly. He maintained that his case was completely different from Protestant heretics because he was defending traditional Christian teaching against novelty, while Protestants were introducing innovations against tradition. He was obeying the universal church, while Protestants were following private judgment against ecclesiastical authority. He was accepting suffering rather than causing it, while Protestants forced their errors on others. These distinctions were meaningful from within More's Catholic perspective, but had no force for those who didn't accept Catholic claims about tradition and authority. The contemporary significance of More's intolerance extends beyond historical interest to ongoing questions about religious freedom, tolerance, and the limits of pluralism. Can societies committed to liberal tolerance extend that tolerance to groups that reject toleration in principle? Should democratic societies protect religious freedom for traditions that would suppress religious freedom if they gained power? More's case suggests how intellectually sophisticated and morally serious people can nevertheless embrace intolerance and violence when they believe truth and social order require it. His combination of personal virtue and public cruelty warns against assuming that moral excellence in some domains guarantees moral judgment in others. Part 13. More's spirituality and religious practice. More's interior spiritual life was as complex and rigorous as his intellectual life. He maintained demanding patterns of prayer, penance, and religious devotion that coexisted with his worldly success and scholarly pursuits. Understanding More's spirituality is essential for understanding why he ultimately chose death rather than compromise on religious principle. His willingness to die made sense only within a worldview that saw earthly life as temporary preparation for eternal existence and that valued spiritual integrity more than physical survival. More's daily spiritual practices began with rising before dawn for prayers and religious meditation. He attended Mass daily when possible and maintained regular times for private prayer throughout the day. He read scripture and spiritual writings systematically, not just as scholarly texts, but as guides for his own spiritual development. He practiced frequent confession and made regular spiritual retreats when his responsibilities permitted. These practices weren't mere external observances, but rather reflected his conviction that the spiritual life required the same discipline and regular practice as intellectual or professional development. The hair shirt that More wore constantly beneath his clothes was his most distinctive spiritual practice. This rough garment, worn next to the skin, caused constant mild discomfort and served multiple spiritual purposes. It reminded him of Christ's suffering and of his own mortality. It practiced the virtue of fortitude by enduring voluntary discomfort. It served as penance for his sins and as mortification of the flesh to strengthen spiritual discipline. Most importantly, it maintained a radical difference between More's exterior appearance and interior reality. Outwardly, he wore the fine clothes appropriate to his position, but inwardly, he practiced the asceticism of a monk. More's relationship with the monastic tradition shaped his entire spiritual life. Although he decided against becoming a monk, he never abandoned his attraction to monastic ideals of prayer, poverty, and withdrawal from worldly concerns. He maintained close relationships with various monastic communities throughout his life, particularly the Carthusians, whom he'd lived with as a young man. He visited monasteries regularly for spiritual renewal and apparently considered monasteries as the ideal form of Christian life, even if his own vocation lay elsewhere. The persecution and dissolution of monasteries under Henry VIII deeply distressed More, both because he valued these communities spiritually and because their destruction demonstrated the king's willingness to overthrow traditional Christian practices for political purposes. More's theology emphasized themes that reflected his spiritual practices and priorities. He focused on human sinfulness and the necessity of grace for any good action. He emphasized Christ's redemptive suffering as the model for Christian life. He stressed the importance of accepting suffering patiently as participation in Christ's passion. He insisted on the reality of judgment, heaven, and hell as the ultimate context that gave meaning to earthly existence. These weren't merely intellectual positions, but rather deep convictions that shaped how he understood his own life and choices. The sacramental life of the Catholic Church was central to More's spirituality. He believed that the sacraments were essential channels of grace without which salvation was impossible. The Mass particularly held profound significance as the representation of Christ's sacrifice and the means by which believers participated in that sacrifice. His belief in transubstantiation, that bread and wine literally became Christ's body and blood during the Mass, made the Eucharist the center of his spiritual life. This sacramental understanding helps explain why More couldn't accept Henry's break with Rome, which threatened to sever English Christians from the sacramental system that mediated saving grace. More's understanding of conscience was fundamentally theological rather than merely psychological or philosophical. Conscience wasn't simply one's internal sense of right and wrong, but rather the point of contact between the human soul and divine truth. A properly formed conscience reflected God's law, written on the human heart and preserved through church teaching. To violate conscience was to sin directly against God, making conscience the ultimate arbiter of right action, even when it conflicted with human authority. This exalted view of conscience made More's final refusal to swear the oath not merely stubbornness, but rather faithful obedience to God's truth as he understood it. More's prayers during his final imprisonment revealed the depth and authenticity of his spiritual life. He composed prayers asking for strength to endure suffering faithfully, for forgiveness of his sins, for grace to love his enemies, and for final perseverance. These weren't formulaic petitions, but rather genuine cries for help from someone who knew his own weakness and feared that he might fail the ultimate test. They showed that More's courage came not from natural bravery, but from faith that God would provide the grace needed to endure when his own strength failed. More's approach to his own death reflected distinctive Christian beliefs about martyrdom. He didn't seek death for its own sake, or embrace it with enthusiasm. He repeatedly expressed his desire to live and his fear of execution. But he accepted death as inevitable once he determined that conscience forbade him to swear the oath. He understood his execution as participation in Christ's suffering and believed that dying for truth would benefit his soul, even though the prospect terrified him. This combination of fear and faith, of resistance to death and acceptance of its necessity, showed that More's martyrdom emerged from religious conviction rather than either fanaticism or nihilism. The prayers, More composed in prison for those about to face execution, particularly moved readers through their psychological realism and spiritual depth. He acknowledged the natural human terror of violent death, while insisting that Christ's presence could transform that terror into peaceful acceptance. He asked for grace to forgive those who condemned him and to pray for their salvation. He expressed confidence that temporary suffering would lead to eternal joy, while admitting his own doubts and fears. These prayers succeeded spiritually and literarily because they emerged from genuine religious experience rather than theoretical pieties. Part 14. More's political realism and practical wisdom. More's political thought combined idealistic visions of social perfection with hard-headed realism about what could actually be achieved in a fallen world. His understanding of politics was shaped by extensive practical experience in government service as well as by his study of classical and Christian political theory. He knew that politics involved not just pursuing abstract justice, but rather negotiating between competing interests, managing human weakness and wickedness, and making difficult choices in circumstances where all available options had serious disadvantages. More's service to Henry VIII required constant navigation between competing obligations and pressures. As a royal counselor, he was expected to provide advice that served the king's interests, but his own moral and religious principles sometimes conflicted with what the king wanted. As a lawyer, he understood how to construct arguments that could defend positions he personally doubted. As a humanist, he believed in the power of reasoned persuasion, but as a practical politician, he recognized that interests and passions often mattered more than arguments. These tensions required sophisticated judgment about when to speak and when to remain silent, when to resist and when to acquiesce. More's famous conversation with his son-in-law Roper revealed his realistic assessment of political service. When Roper praised Cardinal Wolsey's favor toward More, More responded that if his head could win the king a castle in France, it would not fail to fall. This wasn't mere cynicism, but rather clear-sighted recognition that royal favor was instrumental and conditional. Kings valued servants only as long as those servants served royal purposes effectively. The moment a servant's usefulness ended, or their loyalty became questionable, royal favor could transform instantly into fatal displeasure. Successful royal service required understanding this fundamental instability and navigating accordingly. More's advice to Thomas Cromwell during the crisis over the king's marriage showed his sophisticated understanding of political possibilities. According to Roper, More suggested that if Cromwell wanted to please the king, he should tell Henry what he wanted to hear, rather than what was true. More recognized that Henry had decided what he wanted to do, and was looking for justifications rather than genuine counsel. Providing unwelcome advice would accomplish nothing except making the advisor useless to the king. This wasn't encouraging dishonesty, but rather acknowledging that sometimes the advisor's duty was to step aside rather than participate in courses of action they considered wrong. More's own attempt to remain silent about the king's supremacy reflected this realistic political judgment. He recognized that open opposition to the king's policies would be both futile and fatal. It wouldn't change anything except his own survival. His silence was therefore both the most principled action available, refusing to positively affirm what he believed to be false, and the most politically prudent action, avoiding active opposition that would force the king to destroy him. That this strategy ultimately failed demonstrated the limits of political wisdom when confronting determined tyranny, not any flaw in More's judgment about what was possible. More's observation about counsel in Utopia captured his understanding of the counselor's impossible position. He described two approaches to counseling princes: the school philosophy that speaks frankly and pushes for ideal policies regardless of political feasibility, and the practical philosophy that works within existing circumstances to achieve whatever improvements are actually possible. School philosophy maintains integrity but achieves nothing because rulers ignore impractical advice. Practical philosophy achieves incremental improvements but risks compromising principles through constant accommodation to political necessity. More suggested that the counselor must somehow combine both approaches, though he offered no clear guidance about how to achieve this combination. This tension between principle and pragmatism reflected More's understanding that politics inevitably involved moral compromise. Perfect justice was impossible in a fallen world inhabited by sinful human beings. Political arrangements would always involve some injustice, some exploitation, some violence. The question wasn't whether to participate in imperfection, but rather how to minimize injustice while maintaining order and protecting what justice could be achieved. This realistic assessment allowed More to serve a far from perfect king and maintain a far from perfect social system while still advocating for reforms where possible. More's resignation as Lord Chancellor demonstrated his judgment about when accommodation had to end and principle required withdrawal. He recognized that he couldn't continue to serve Henry once the king's policies moved from matters More disagreed with to matters that required his positive participation in what he believed to be wrong. As long as he could implement royal policies in his official capacity while maintaining private reservations about those policies, service was possible. But once continuing in office would require swearing to propositions he believed false or implementing policies he believed sinful, resignation became necessary. This distinction between passive acquiescence and active participation marked the boundary between legitimate political compromise and impermissible moral complicity. More's practical wisdom extended beyond high politics to social questions and human relationships. His letters showed sophisticated understanding of how to maintain relationships under stress, how to encourage others without demanding impossible standards, and how to combine honesty with kindness. His management of his household demonstrated his ability to create functional order while respecting individual personality and capacity. His judicial service showed his ability to discover truth in complex factual situations where different parties presented conflicting accounts. These practical capacities grounded his political thought in reality rather than leaving it at the level of abstract speculation. Yet More's practical wisdom had limits that contributed to his tragedy. He apparently failed to recognize how completely Henry VIII's determination to remarry had overwhelmed the king's earlier intellectual and religious commitments. He underestimated the king's willingness to break with Rome and overthrow traditional institutions to achieve his purposes. He believed that silence could protect him when Henry actually demanded positive affirmation. These misjudgments suggest that even sophisticated political understanding couldn't fully account for the unprecedented character of Henry's actions or the ruthlessness with which the king pursued his will. Part 15. More's Legacy and Contemporary Relevance. Thomas More was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church in 1935, exactly 400 years after his execution. But his legacy extends far beyond Catholic veneration to encompass his influence on political philosophy, legal theory, literature, and debates about conscience and authority that remain relevant today. Understanding. More's contemporary significance requires distinguishing between the various ways his life and thought have been appropriated and recognizing the genuine questions his example continues to raise. More's political legacy is most evident in the enduring influence of utopia. The very word utopia has entered common usage to describe ideal societies that likely can't be achieved in practice. More's book created a new literary genre of imaginary societies used to criticize existing arrangements, influencing works from Francis Bacon's New Atlantis to contemporary science fiction. The specific institutions described in Utopia, communal property, democratic participation, religious tolerance, humane criminal justice have inspired social movements and political reforms across centuries. Socialist and communist movements claimed More as a forerunner, though whether he'd have endorsed their programs is deeply questionable. More's legal legacy appears in the principle that silence cannot be construed as denial, and that accused persons have the right to remain silent without that silence being used against them. His defense at trial articulated principles of legal interpretation and procedural fairness that have influenced common law development. His judicial service provided a model of how judges should maintain independence from political pressure while administering law fairly. His ultimate willingness to defy unjust law rather than violate conscience inspired later legal theorists who sought to establish limits on positive law's authority. More's literary legacy extends from the technical innovations in Utopia and his other works to his influence on how writers approached social criticism and moral questions. The dialogue form he perfected allowed presentation of complex philosophical questions through dramatic conversation rather than didactic exposition. His combination of humor and seriousness showed that important matters could be addressed with wit rather than solemn portentousness. His autobiographical writings, particularly his Tower Letters, influenced the development of personal literature that used individual experience to illuminate universal questions. More's religious legacy is most obvious in Catholic tradition, where he's honored as a martyr who died rather than betray his faith. His example has inspired Catholics facing persecution in various times and places to maintain their faith despite threats and pressure. The specific issue he died for, papal authority and the independence of the Church from state control, remains important in Catholic teaching about the relationship between temporal and spiritual authority. His combination of worldly success with spiritual discipline provides a model for how Catholics can live faithfully while fully engaged in secular professions and political service. But More's religious significance extends beyond Catholic veneration to ecumenical appreciation for his witness to the primacy of conscience. Many non-Catholics recognize More's courage in following conscience despite fatal consequences, even while disagreeing with the specific religious positions he defended. His final stand has been invoked by conscientious objectors, political dissidents, and others who've resisted authority in the name of higher principles. The fact that he was executed for the same kind of religious nonconformity he'd prosecuted in others creates a tragic irony that complicates simple celebration of his martyrdom, but doesn't diminish the courage his resistance required. More's example raises enduring questions about conscience, authority, and resistance that remain relevant for contemporary life. When should individuals obey legitimate authority even when they disagree with particular commands? When does obedience become complicity in wrongdoing? How can we distinguish between principled conscience and mere stubbornness? What are the proper limits of political authority's claims on individual belief and action? How can societies balance the need for order and common purpose with respect for individual conviction? More's life doesn't provide simple answers to these questions, but rather demonstrates their difficulty and their significance. The problematic aspects of More's legacy, particularly his intolerance and his role in persecuting heretics, complicate his veneration and raise important questions about moral evaluation of historical figures. Should More's courage in dying for conscience excuse his cruelty toward those who followed their own consciences in opposing Catholic teaching? Can we admire his integrity while condemning his intolerance? How do we assess historical figures who combined admirable and reprehensible qualities? These questions have no easy answers, but avoiding them through either hagiography or dismissal fails to engage seriously with the complexity of More's actual life and thought. Contemporary political debates about religious freedom, secularism, and pluralism reflect tensions that More's case illuminates. He believed that religious truth was objective and that political authority should enforce that truth for society's spiritual benefit. Most liberal democracies now reject this position, instead protecting religious freedom while maintaining secular public institutions. But the question of whether there are truths and values that transcend individual choice and that society should actively promote remains contested. More's conviction that some things matter too much to be left to individual discretion challenges easy, liberal assumptions about neutrality and tolerance. More's significance for legal theory appears in ongoing debates about the relationship between law and morality, the proper role of conscience in legal obligation, and the conditions under which civil disobedience becomes justified. His distinction between legitimate law that deserves obedience and unjust commands that should be resisted influenced natural law theory and contemporary human rights discourse. His insistence that procedural fairness matters even when dealing with those accused of serious wrongs remains relevant for debates about due process, rights of the accused, and the limits of security measures justified by public safety concerns. More's literary legacy continues to influence how writers approach social criticism and political philosophy. The device of imagining alternative societies to criticize existing ones remains vital in contemporary speculative fiction. The use of dialogue to present multiple perspectives on complex questions without definitively resolving them continues in philosophical and literary writing. The combination of entertainment and serious purpose that characterized More's best work provides a model for how ideas can be communicated to wider audiences beyond academic specialists. Ultimately, Thomas More's significance lies not in providing answers that we should simply accept, but rather in the questions his life and thought continue to raise about the human condition, about the tensions between individual and community, between conscience and authority, between worldly success and spiritual integrity, between justice as we imagine it and the compromises that practical politics requires. His combination of brilliance and blindness, courage and cruelty, vision and limitation makes him a figure we can neither simply celebrate nor simply condemn. He remains, 5 centuries after his death, a mirror in which we see reflected both human greatness and human weakness, both the possibility of moral heroism and the tragic costs that such heroism sometimes requires. His life reminds us that people of intelligence, learning, and goodwill can reach radically different conclusions about fundamental questions, and that sometimes these differences can't be reconciled through more careful reasoning or better information. It shows us that moral integrity sometimes requires sacrifice, but doesn't provide simple formulas for determining when such sacrifice becomes necessary. It demonstrates that human beings are capable of dying for what they believe to be true, even when others regard those beliefs as wrong or even harmful. And it forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that the very qualities that make people admirable in some contexts, courage, conviction, willingness to suffer for principle, can become dangerous or even destructive when wedded to intolerant certainties. Thomas More died declaring that he was the King's good servant, but God's first. This final statement captured the tension that defined his entire life. The attempt to serve earthly authorities faithfully while maintaining ultimate loyalty to truth and conscience. Whether we admire his choice, question his certainties, or struggle with the contradictions his life embodied, we cannot escape the fundamental challenge his example presents. What matters enough that we would sacrifice everything for it? And how can we be sure we're right?